Good afternoon and welcome to the Asheville City Council work session. This is our second work session regarding the American Rescue Plan funds that the city is going to receive. Before I turn it over to the city manager, let me just briefly say in terms of the process, we're going to be looking today at some categories to consider for spending this money. But we don't have to vote on anything today. We're hearing more information based on the feedback we gave the last work session. And tonight, the city, during our city council meeting, we'll have on the agenda this item as well, and an opportunity for the public to provide some feedback so that we'll have that information before we do take a final vote at a future meeting regarding the categories that we want to spend this money on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the city manager, Deborah Campbell.
Thank you, Mayor, and good afternoon, everyone. I think the mayor really set this up very well. We will have Patricia Rosenberg, who will be doing the majority of the presentation and the heavy lifting as it relates to presenting information about this subject matter. So I'll just turn it over to her. But before I do, again, I just want to emphasize that we are not asking for any specific vote or action at this work session. So Patricia, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Deborah. Next slide, please. So this afternoon at our work session, we want to go over a few things with you. We'll do a quick review of the ARPA grants. So we'll look at it from a broad view, and then we'll narrow it down specifically to the fiscal recovery funds, which is the $26.2 million that we'll spend the majority of this afternoon talking about. We'll go through some recommended categories to be funded, and we'll stop and have some review and discussion time with all of you. And then we'll go through the RFP process and the community outreach and also ask for a discussion with all of you. Next slide. So I wanted to start today with a broad overview of the ARPA grants. So what you're seeing on your screen right now are the community awards. And this list really focuses on direct allocations to the governments that have the possibility of impacting Asheville. So in addition to the funds that the city of Asheville will directly be receiving, what you're seeing here are what the county has received and also what the state of North Carolina has received or is receiving. So in both the county and the state, similarly to the city, received the state and local government fiscal recovery funds, and that it was awarded to every state, local, and tribal government in the country. And so for the county, they received a little over $50 million, and the state received $5.4 billion. And similarly to the city, both the county and the state are in the same way addressing their process and deciding how they are going to elect to spend those funds. There are also some grants that are covered in the ARPA that are a little bit more specific than the fiscal recovery funds. So you're seeing some things related to housing. The Housing Authority received some emergency housing vouchers, and both the county and the state received emergency rental assistance. The county received $7.9 million, and the state received $547 million. In addition to that, similarly, the state received homeowner assistance of $273 million, and that is a fund that they're still working through the process of how that is going to be awarded and allocated throughout the state. A few other funds that you're seeing on this, the county is receiving a transportation grant of $1.2 million, and that's to help with their paratransit services. And then to go back to the state, the Capital Projects Fund of $277 million is really to highlight broadband infrastructure across the state. And again, that is a process that they're still working to determine how that will be allocated and awarded. The state's receiving money, the $3.7 million to help the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program. And then lastly, the $3.6 billion which is going to help fund elementary and secondary school education. So again, this slide here is really focusing on direct allocations to governments. However, there are almost 100 different grant opportunities that were throughout the ARPA. And those benefit governments, industries, businesses, nonprofits, households, and individuals. And due to the sheer size, we were unable to capture everything that might be coming through our community. I wanted to make it clear that it is more than just what you see on this list. There are some that are directly to industries. For example, there's a grant fund specifically for the National Endowment to the Arts. There was a separate grant fund that was for restaurant recovery. And those are just a couple of the very many different grant awards that are throughout this, that were allocated through the ARPA. Next slide. So on this side, I really want to talk about the direct allocations to the city. And we had mentioned this at the last work session, but I really want to highlight a few of these again. So again, we'll spend the majority of today speaking about the fiscal recovery funds. That's a $26.2 million that the city is receiving. In addition to that, we are receiving home funds for housing. And the city will be receiving part of the $4.7 million. So the city was awarded $4.7 million, but it's allocated for a 4-county region. And unlike the fiscal recovery funds, where the ultimate decision is really coming to council, the spending for the home funds is going to be decided by the Asheville Regional Housing Consortium. And right now, at this point, they're still awaiting guidance on how those home funds can be spent. So we're expecting to see more information this fall and winter regarding those funds. Our public transportation system, so for our ART Transit, we received $1.8 million, and that is mostly to covering operating costs this year. And then lastly, we received the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant of $1.6 million, and that was awarded to Harris Cherokee Center. And it covers their revenue losses over the past year and a half while they remained closed during the pandemic. Next slide, please. And this slide is also similar to something that you saw at the last work session. So this is the approved funds for the fiscal. And so again, this is going back specifically to the fiscal recovery funds, the $26.2 million that the city is receiving. So there's some of those funds have already been approved by council. And those are some of the funds for the emergency non-congregate homeless shelter, some of the public portable restrooms, and the homeward bound acquisition of Days Inn. In addition to what has been previously approved, we wanted to highlight some of the things that we know are coming in the next few months for council approval. Later tonight on your council meeting agenda, there is a budget amendment for the revenue losses. We are requesting $1.6 million of revenue losses, which is an approved use of the fiscal recovery funds. And those are strictly for the parking fund, which is the only fund that we feel at this point that we're making a recommendation that needs the revenue loss funds. So, and in September, at your council meeting, you'll see 2 budget amendments. One is for the staff administrative costs, and that's to hire a few new employees who will help manage these funds over the next few years. Additionally, we'll be asking for additional money for the emergency non-congregate homeless shelter. That's to continue to house people at the Ramada Inn. And then lastly, we're unsure of the council date, but we're looking at the hotel purchase and operating costs of an emergency shelter. And the cost that you're seeing on this slide is 50% of the estimate. But the last 2 items on this list, the emergency non-congregate homeless shelter and the emergency shelter, both of those costs may change as we work through those. So what you'll see after all of these costs, assuming that everything on the upcoming amendments get passed by council, the total remaining funds for ARPA is it's almost $9.7 million. And that's really what we'll be talking about for the rest of this meeting. Okay, so I want to pause and see if there are any questions about what I've covered so far. Next slide, please.
Is anyone, this is Sage, is anyone able to speak to whether or not the parking department has, or the fund has any reserves?
Tony, do you want to address that?
Or is it zeroed out, or I don't know how bad it got. I know that we gave up some income producing individual parking spaces for outdoor dining. We did free parking and decks and stuff to, encourage people to still use downtown. I don't know if we depleted our reserves. I was just curious before we replenish.
Yeah, this is Tony. I'm happy to answer that. We did, after about a year and a half of seeing parking revenues come in under budget, the reserves that we had in that fund are pretty much at zero at this point.
Thank you.
Following up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Following up on Sage's question, I am curious about the parking funds being replenished with this funding source as well, especially because with our stated climate emergency, we have a Buncombe County state of emergency with the flooding that's in place. I don't think that we're in a position to not address the fact that climate change outcomes are upon us now. And I think we have to look at our parking fund ongoing as if we should be driving cars, if we should be encouraging driving cars, and also if we were to consider using our general fund, if there's not a parking fund balance to cover this gap, then we would have $1.6 million in ARPA funds to address additional needs in our community. And those are needs that are so urgent at this very moment, especially we still are waiting for a Climate Justice Initiative report back from our own outreach endeavors. So I know that may not be a recommendation from staff at this time, but I would like to know what the impact on our general fund would be if we use the general fund balance instead of the ARPA funds to replace the parking fees.
And I just wanted to piggybacking on that, and thank you for that comment. So maybe someone on staff can speak to the relationship in conjunction with what Councilwoman Roney's talking about of the parking fund and the transit funding, because there is a relationship funding wise, and of course that our support of a robust transit system is in part an effort to address environmental issues.
I think, Esther, that it is near that number. I think we give 1.5 or 1.6 million a year. I'm sorry, Gwen. I didn't mean to speak before your turn.
I would ask Tony if he could respond to how the parking fund supports transit, as well as the conversation that we had early on when we started the budget process was to look at loss of revenue, because we fundamentally think that the ARPA funds, fundamentally, it's the purpose of the funding is to not only repair damage within the community, but also repair damage from a governmental perspective of loss of revenue and in terms of our operations. And this is so far the only recommendation that we are recommending in terms of loss of revenue. We were very proactive in terms of, for the Harris Center, to see if there were other revenue opportunities. And there was another grant opportunity that we sought in order to support that, replenish that loss of revenue. But I'll stop there. Tony, if you could address the transit relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Councilmember Turner is correct. The transfer from parking to support transit is about 1.6 million every year. And City Manager Campbell is also correct. As we highlighted to you all during the budget process, there were revenue losses in transit, in Harrah's Center, and also in the parking fund. And as you all know, we've gotten the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant revenue to offset the loss of the Harris Center, and also some additional ARPA money in transit to help with that fund. And so really it's the parking fund that we're only looking at to replenish the revenue losses. And The calculation we did, the U.S. Treasury provided a formula for us to calculate revenue loss, and we're actually eligible to claim a lot more revenue loss than what we're claiming for the parking fund, but we're trying to be very cautious and really only focus on that one fund that we think needs the money to replenish it and get its fund balance levels back up, and also continue to be able to make that transfer to the transit fund moving forward.
Thank you. It is not lost on me that we are funding transit with our parking funds. I think that's appropriate, and I am very familiar. However, because this is part of our public engagement, I think it does help that the community knows more about this conversation. And the rainy day is quite literally here, and we have a general fund balance while our community is scraping together resources to try to make ends meet and to get people out of harm's way. We've had loss of life in Western North Carolina, and people are calling for us to have more resiliency. So that's why I'm asking us for us to use our general fund balance as the rainy day instead of competing with other very significant needs in our community.
Gwen, it says you still have your hand up. Do you have your hand up?
I do.
Okay, good.
Could you go back to the slide right before this? Can I ask, the emergency non-congregate homeless shelter, the 1.2, it's my understanding that's basically going to be between September 1st or maybe the end of August through December 31 or something around that. Why is the relationship? So we've spent or committed to $1.7 million, and I think that was longer than 4 months that we were operating an emergency non-congregate homeless shelter. And so I guess I'm looking at kind of the relationship of 1.2 to 1.7 and wondering if it's expected to be the same per month as we've had in the past, or is it different? See what I'm asking?
Yeah, I believe Kathy is on the line. Kathy, are you able to respond to that question?
Yes, ma'am. It is approximately the same per month with a little variation in the front. I will tell you that we're going to be asking partners to help cover some of this. So this is the worst case scenario, I would say.
Okay.
But there is a little variation of what we were paying at the beginning based on the number of folks that were coming in.
Okay, thank you.
Kathy, could you clarify that? So of the 1.2, we might seek partnerships on as much as half, or is the 1.2 our part in total?
That is the maximum cost.
Oh, okay.
So we are seeking partners to help cover the maximum cost.
Perfect, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay, can we go forward 2 slides? So again, when speaking of ARPA, what we really want to focus on for the remainder of today's meeting is the fiscal recovery funds. And we wanted to center this around the guidance we received from the Treasury Department, and really what was the goal of receiving this $26.2 million that, again, so every local government, every municipality, every state government, every travel government in the country is receiving fiscal recovery funds. And really the goal is to support governments in responding to the economic and public health impacts, to help contain those impacts on our communities, on our residents and our businesses, and also to start laying a foundation to help build a strong and equitable recovery. So as we talk through what our staff recommendations are for how to fund or how to use these funds, we really want to center them around these goals. Next slide. So with those goals in mind, the Treasury Department has issued allowable uses for these funds. And we went into a little more detail at the last work session. I'm going to keep I really want to make sure that we're emphasizing what those allowable uses are without spending too much time today focusing on them. So they really are our public health uses, and that's really the public health as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that includes mental health and behavioral health as well. The negative economic impacts, and particularly in the negative economic impacts, looking at the disparate impacts of our low income and BIPOC communities. An allowable use is additional pay for essential workers. So that's providing some sort of one-time bonus or hourly bonus over a usual salary for essential workers who have been working in the front line of the pandemic. Revenue losses, which we've already mentioned, we're really only claiming revenue losses for our parking fund. Investments in infrastructure, and that's specifically around water, stormwater, and broadband infrastructure. And then lastly, crime response and prevention. Next slide. So to talk a little bit about the evaluation process the city has already gone through. So we're starting really looking at categories to be funded through the ARPA. So, and what we have evaluated at this point have been a total of 24 categories. And those were identified through our community engagement data that we've undertaken over the past few years. We looked at internal requests from city departments to make sure that we were capturing categories. And then lastly, we sent out a survey to council and added any additional categories. So again, we evaluated a total of 24 categories for consideration. And then we took those 24 categories and put them through an evaluation process. We created that process using the 6 guiding principles that were identified throughout the budget work sessions. And again, I want to emphasize that the guiding principles that we're really focusing on were using an equity lens, investing in resilience, aligning with priorities, focusing on measurable impact, leveraging partnerships, and considering the long term. And with those 6 guiding principles in our evaluation process, we had 16 employees from the different departments across the city. And they scored and put them through that evaluation process. And at the last work session, we presented results. We presented the top 25, the middle 25 to 50%, and the lowest bottom 50%. And those results, the top, middle, and low, are really about alignment with the 6 guiding principles. All 25 categories that were considered for evaluation, we consider to be city priorities. Next slide. So at this point, we're coming to you with recommended categories. So these are staff recommendations that really came from, again, a utilization of the evaluation process we went through, the community engagement data that we've already looked through and that we continue to receive, and lastly, the feedback that we got at the last council work session. So we have a total of 8 categories, and they're split through 2 slides, but I want to make sure that y'all know that that we are going to be going through 2 slides worth of recommended categories. And again, they're affordable. We are recommending affordable housing. So to increase access for low and moderate income households, we're recommending homelessness services, which improves access to stable and affordable housing for unhoused individuals. That's something that council has already invested some of the ARPA funding into. We're recommending small business recovery, which is to help support businesses recover from pandemic-related losses or to build resilience for the future. And something that we, as part of small business recovery, at the last work session, we presented 2 separate categories of small business recovery and public infrastructure for adaptability. And we've combined the public infrastructure because we believe that the public infrastructure really has a huge impact on the small business recovery. For public infrastructure, we're really referring to parklets and other opportunities for businesses to use public outdoor space. So an example of that is the AVL Share Spaces program. It was created as temporary throughout the pandemic, but this funding could be expanded to become a permanent city program. And then also workforce development, which is to help create programs that will help train unemployed or underemployed workers for long-term employment. Next slide. And then our other recommendations for categories to fund are food systems, and that's really in promoting and supporting a food system from farm to disposal. We're recommending city infrastructure, and specifically around city infrastructure that's improving city buildings for safety and to create resilient work environments. Recommending domestic violence prevention and assistance. And those are projects to mitigate increases in domestic violence during the pandemic, or to prevent domestic violence through supportive housing. And then lastly, the 8th category that we're recommending to fund is community communication. And that's really increasing community access to decision-making. And that's looking at digital improvements to city conference rooms, as well as to community-owned premises. And that's to help increase digital or remote access to our public meetings. Next slide, please. So we're recommending those 8 categories to be funding, but we do want to call attention to the other categories that we have been considering and match them up. Part of the reason why we felt that we're not recommending them is most of those other categories have potential funding available through other sources. So as you can see from this chart, there are several categories that have separate ARPA grants. So when those include transit and childcare, utility building, arts and cultural expression, and public health, mental health, and substance abuse. Additionally, it's not on this slide, but we believe that we're following, and it has not been confirmed yet, but the opioid settlement might potentially be able to help fund public health, mental health, and substance abuse if that becomes fully enacted. And so there are a few categories that we considered that were around infrastructure, and we are closely following the pending federal infrastructure bill because we believe those can potentially be funded through that. We have our strategic partnership funds and our neighborhood grants. And I would say both of those, while listing separately, our youth programming and our community-led capacity building. Depending on the specific project, either of those funding sources might be applicable. I did want to highlight additional pay for employees that we did issue a one-time bonus to our essential frontline workers who had been working out in the community throughout the pandemic, and they received a bonus last December, and that was funded through our coronavirus relief funds. Additionally, through this last budget cycle in June, Council approved our new compensation plan, which added additional pay for employees. And for those reasons, we feel like the additional pay has been covered and we're not recommending it for ARPA funds. And then the other categories listed, the care for aging residents, emergency planning, and employee retention and recruitment. We are continuing to look for other funds to match those needs. Next slide, please.
Patricia, there's a question from Councilwoman Roney.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kim.
Thank you. So regarding the federal infrastructure bill, if it passes, can you clarify if that's anticipated to go to municipalities directly or if it would be funneled through the state?
I'm not sure if you can speak to that.
Thanks for that question, Councilwoman Roney. It to be determined. It's still right now being debated, obviously, within the houses of Congress, but it appears that most of this would funnel through the state. But that has been one of the issues that has at least been discussed. So I would think it would be premature at this point to say that it is absolutely going to be one or the other.
Thank you. That was how I was seeing things unfold as well. And my concern is because our road infrastructure funding is so in a deficit right now in the state of North Carolina, is my understanding that if we received federal infrastructure funding and it were to be funneled through the state, that would be mostly absorbed into our highway and road infrastructure for state maintained roads. So that would mean that we may not have funds for these 4 very top emergency issues in our community. So I wanted to bring some awareness to that, because as we're watching the process unfold, we shouldn't be surprised if we put environmental protection and sustainability, stormwater infrastructure, transportation connectivity, and water infrastructure on a back burner where there's going to be no heat.
Thank you, Kim. Next slide, Beth. So I want to stop here because we went through the categories that staff is recommending for funding, and give council an opportunity for discussion, and provide feedback on what you would like us to see, to have you vote on September 14th for categories that will be included in an RFP process.
Thank you, Patricia. This is Sage. I think you've done a great job. I personally feel like we've come to a good place with this list, and I really appreciate that slide that shared some of the other sources for our other concerns, because I think in no way does this list represent everything we're worried about. We just are associating other funds with some of these. So these are the ones left without direct funding from other initiatives. So I appreciate the work so far. I'm feeling pretty comfortable. What I'm looking forward to is hearing from the public from this point.
I would like to add something. After looking at these categories, there are a few things that I find concerning. And one thing is I see the affordable housing, but I think that maybe if we could have something in here to assist homeowners with repairs. And the only reason I say that is because, like right now, we just went through tremendous, storm. Many people I've spoken with, they have water in their basements. Their roofs are leaking. This is an opportunity for us to take some time to get in the community to figure out how many people we can help salvage their homes, because they will be homeless if they, unable to maintain them. So I think if I would like to see added some type of something here to assist homeowners at this particular time, in light of, because a lot of people don't have funds right now because of COVID and different things. I think that's something we need to address. Because like I said, I've already had people reaching out to me that are experiencing a lot of these issues, and we need some kind of fund set up to address that need.
So I thought we had a housing rehab program using community development block grant funding. And then I would ask Patricia, is this something that could come under the umbrella of affordable housing?
I think it potentially could be, depending on what projects and proposals we see come in through the RFP. I will also point out again that the state has received $273 million specifically for homeowner assistance, and they are still working through and taking comments on how that program should be allocated. So they're receiving $273 million, none of which has been allocated throughout the state yet. And that is directly for homeowner assistance.
That's great. I know MHO also has a program. Sandra, I think your concern is terrific. It's very much a need right now. And I think there's probably some avenues that would still fit under this affordable housing, whether it's keeping people housed, keeping people in their affordable needs. I mean, are you talking about just anyone that needs repairs, or those that would income qualify for things, or still in the affordability range? You're muted.
Of course, I think that we should address the needs of the lower income of the people that really need it at this time. And one thing I'm concerned about too, and the reason I bring that up, because when I looked at the list of things that we're funding with the AARP funds, it looks like over 13 million is going to deal with issues as far as homelessness and things of that nature. That is a concern because we've got over 80 to 90 million other people here basically that, I'm just saying that need at least 30, but anyways, a lot of people in the community that need certain services that I think it is important for the city to connect to the people in the community and their needs with these funds, because this is an opportunity for city council to say we're concerned about the community too, the people that don't really complain or the people that's just getting by. I think that we need to have more outreach with programs that they can see that the city is doing. And that's one thing I think that the city has often done is sometimes when we fund different services and we fund them out to other people to do them, people don't realize these are things coming from the city. AARP funds, everybody has their, ARP funds, everybody has their eye on what the city is going to do for the people in the community. So I think we should be mindful as to how we distribute funds and how we take care of the people in the community, or how we address it.
Can I just remind people that we have not voted on spending $13 million on the homeless, that $9 million hasn't been voted on, it hasn't been committed, and at least for me, I'm certainly hoping that we're gonna get other partners that are gonna take that $9 million substantially lower than it is right now.
Good point, Gwen. And the vote on that has been moved back so that we do have an opportunity to flesh out those partnerships before we have to vote to spend that money. But to Councilwoman Kilgore's point, I think what I heard you say, Deborah, is that there is flexibility in the housing category to include support for homeowner assistance as a potential, because again, what we're talking about here is for the funds that the city's not spending, we will issue, and Patricia will get into this a little bit more, RFPs for partnership agencies who provide services. So for example, it could be a Mountain Housing Opportunities who already does homeowner assistance and comes in and part of their program is to perform repairs. Someone like that might respond to the RFP and be able to administer through this funding some of those services. So I think what I heard you say is that these categories allow for, they're broad enough that they would include that type of service.
Yes,
Yes.
that's what I just wanted to make sure it did.
Okay.
Because I just didn't want,
Yeah. And it's, I would say that of all the recovery funds, not just coming to Asheville, but to the state and the county and other agencies, there is a lot in terms of housing assistance, whether it's rental assistance or eviction prevention or homeowner assistance, such as you're talking about. It's a little frustrating because some of it's already been funded. I know the county was sitting on $7 million, and some of it's like, as you talked about, reaching out to the community, getting that communications down, helping people know how to tap into those resources, apply for those funds and get them. And then there's other issues like the state still who's sitting around doing, not that anyone's dilly-dallying, but they're coming up with their guidelines for how they're going to spend their funds that are earmarked for these kinds of things. So, we're one piece of the puzzle here, but there's a lot happening there, and just sort of coordinating it all is such a challenge.
And Mayor, also in response to storm relief, because of the proactive emergency declaration, we would potentially be eligible for Federal Emergency Management Association money to assist homeowners or property owners in general with repairs. So even if it's not ARPA, we think that there are other funding opportunities to address Ms. Kilgore's concern.
Thank you.
If there aren't any other questions, I think, Patricia, you want to keep Go
I'm sorry. One other question. I know, anyway, one other concern that I'm concerned about is this. And I don't know if there's anything that we could do with these funds to assist with that. But as you know, the economy is suffering greatly because there are plenty of jobs out there. There are tons of jobs, and there are, I'd say, a shortage of workers. But I don't know if there's a shortage of workers or it's just that the workers and the jobs are not connected. And I realize that a lot of jobs need a whole lot more training, and that's what you're speaking of here. But there are plenty of jobs out there that do not need training, or they offer training but are unable to get employees. So what I'm trying to figure out, and maybe someone can help me with this, is in a lot of the areas, especially the lower income areas, what I'm finding, and I spoke with the people in the community about this, a lot of people are not applying for these jobs because they can't get to the jobs. And our transit system does not afford, it's not really geared up to address a lot of the issues that we have with this. And so I'm thinking if it's anything that we can do in the communities, especially some of the communities that's hard hit, that where people do not have transportation to get to these jobs, is it anything that we can do to start connecting these communities with these jobs so that they can start making their own money and then they can start being self-sufficient? I think that's a bit disconnect that if it's any kind of way that we can address this, what could we do to assist?
Ms. Kilgore, the response that I would have to that is if you all approved these categories, I would see that if a nonprofit or some other entity wanted to work with us and provided a proposal in response to our RFP process that Patricia will talk to you about shortly, the small business recovery and the workforce development, I think would be those categories where something of that nature would fit neatly into these categories. So I think that there's definitely the potential. The issue is who out there, because hardly any of these categories would be direct services that the city would deliver. We're looking to partner with other entities to have these categories and specific things that we get from the RFP funded. We would be obviously managing the grants and dispersing the funding, but it wouldn't be us being the direct service provider.
Yes, I could understand that, but I'm trying to figure out a way that we could actually provide funding for or to supplement a transit to do this, because what it is doing this would not be very profitable, of course, so they would need some type of funding. But I just think that's a big gap that we're overlooking. It sort of reminds me of when Emily talked about the people that were in the shelters and how most of the people didn't even have IDs, things that we don't think about. Because we're okay, we have IDs, we have our cars, but for a lot of the people that's living in public housing and they don't have access to cars or either transportation to get to these jobs. And even if they could catch the bus, usually the jobs, they're very demanding and they may call, but then you have to get your child to your mother's house in order to go to work. So without some type of transportation assistance for these communities, it's no way in the world, it's almost like you're trying to get from point A to point B, but it's no way to get there because they don't really have that that part in there that's missing to help them get on their feet.
I would like to support services around caring for elderly to rise to a funding category. When I think about when we were sheltering in place and how they were impacted by the lack of mobility to get food and medication, it was life-threatening to that group, especially because they have so many needs related to their health that were not met, during the pandemic and could be threatened if we have to deal with variants.
I support what Sandra and Shanika have brought to the table. And I think about that we ended service to Spruce Hill Apartments, our own city transit service at the beginning of the pandemic, and neighbors didn't have access to health and human services, to groceries, and cabs weren't available, and ride sharing services were not available. So a lot of folks were having to run errands for people. I think one of the best things that we could do within our scope of work is ensure that our transit system is ready to expand hours of service in time for the October 31st deadline. That is within the scope of our capacity.
Okay, any other, and again, we'll be able to, this will be on our agenda for tonight. We'll be able to hear some public input, and of course we can have some further discussion, and then it'll be on our agenda again before we solidify it. Any other questions before Patricia finishes this presentation?
Okay.
Next slide, Patricia.
Next slide. Okay, so I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about our RFP process. So after council votes on September 14th for which categories will be funded, the city will be looking to develop an RFP and evaluate those proposals. We're looking to have the RFP open to nonprofit organizations and government entities. And government entities include internal city departments that may have project proposals for the categories listed in the RFP. We plan to leave the RFP open for 6 weeks. We're hoping with the 6 weeks timeline that will give us ample opportunity to have the RFP done in conjunction with community outreach. And we'll also hold an information session for interested applicants to provide additional information about the RFP and give them an opportunity to answer questions. We'll also allow them to formally submit questions, and we'll put out an addendum for our RFP. But I do want to mention, in addition to the RFP around the ARPA funds, we want to do extensive community outreach. We want to do it combined with our other city grant initiatives. So as our community thinks about funding opportunities and projects proposals that they may have to request city funds, there are other city grant opportunities that may be a better fit than the ARPA. By doing all of the outreach as a combined effort, we can direct people to the appropriate grant funding initiative. And so some of those other city grants include our neighborhood grants program that was just launched and included in this year's budget. We have strategic partnership grants in addition to racial healing mini grants. And again, the idea there is to really guide interested applicants to the right source of funding, whether that's the ARPA funding or other grant initiatives. And next slide. And then I want to go through some, I'll start.
Patricia, yeah.
Thank you, Patricia. Can you go back to, yes, thank you. Given the fact that the county has double the amount of funds that we have, I just really encourage that whatever we're doing around this RFP process is coordinated, and that we don't get ahead of the county and the county doesn't get ahead of us, so that either we're identifying people who can go to the county or go to the city or whatever it may be. So I really kind of keep asking that question. And then just a reminder is that frankly this I caution us being like in a big rush to do this, given the fact that these funds will not be available until mid-2022, right? We get the 13 million and then you wait for the remaining 13 million. So, there's not going to be any funds available until kind of a long time from now. So I guess I would kind of remind us of that from the standpoint of timing.
Gwen, I think, Patricia, can you clarify, or either Tony, we actually have our first tranche. It's in the bank. And then the next allocation will be available, I think, sometime in the spring, which would, the next 13
Right, but
will be available in 22.
We pretty much, I mean, we've darn close to earmarked the first 13 already.
That's
So, you know, we're not going to have the new funding available until, whatever, like May of next year, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Tony, did you want to talk about that a little bit?
No, I think you all covered it already.
Okay. Go ahead.
This is Kim. I have a question about the RFP process while we're on this slide before we move on. And that's, what is the point system going to look like? Because we have a recent example with a point system that we used for 8 Riverside Drive RFP. And it's been interesting to hear community feedback on participating in that process. But we have established a goal for an equitable recovery with these funds. So can we speak a little bit to the point system that we're walking up towards?
We don't know it yet.
That is something that is currently in development with city staff. I do hear your point about an equitable recovery, and it's something that we plan to incorporate throughout the point system, however that looks. So it's a key element in the Treasury guidance. Obviously, it's a huge initiative and a guidepost for the city, and we'll make sure that that's incorporated as much as we possibly can in the RFP evaluations.
Thank you for that answer. And then, do we have an idea of when we could expect to see what that process could look like? Some sort of timeline?
Actually, I will. Next slide, please, and I'll talk about that. So tonight at City Council, we will have an opportunity for public comment on the categories that we're recommending for funding. And September 14th, the council will approve the category allocations. Throughout this time, city staff we're already meeting and working through developing an RFP process, including what that evaluation process looks like. So that it will be incorporated into an RFP so that any potential applicant will see exactly what the evaluation criteria will be in the RFP. So at the latest, it will be available in October when we open our RFP process to the community. We're hoping to have it again open for 6 weeks. We're looking to aim for the due date for proposals to be November 15th. And then through late November, early December, we'll be evaluating the proposals and coming up with staff recommendations for project awards. And then on the council meeting on December 14th, we will bring staff recommendations and have council approval of the final project awards.
Thank you for this. So where in this window of time might we expect to see the Climate Justice Initiative report back? Or the Stormwater Task Force report back, for that matter?
I think the Climate Justice report, we might be able to get information on that to you as, probably before the end of the day, but I'm not sure about the stormwater one and the time frame for that one, Ms. Roney.
Okay, well, since both of those are in this list, that would be so helpful as soon as we can get them. I know the Stormwater Task Force, when I reached out to members, said that the report was going to be delivered. So looking forward to that.
Okay, we'll get that information to you as soon as we can.
Okay, then next slide. That's all I have. Are there any questions or comments or discussion that y'all like to have about the categories or the RFP and community outreach processes?
Okay, seize this opportunity, Patricia. All right, Mayor, we're done.
Okay, great. All right, folks, we're done, and we'll see you back here virtually at 5 o'clock this evening.
And if we could get here just a little earlier, just to do the testing, mic checks and so forth, about 10 till would be great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.